In this episode, Alex Mustonen, co-founder of Snarkitecture, explores the art of designing immersive spaces, the balance between creative freedom and client expectations, and how the next generation of architects is shaping the future. Stay tuned to discover the mind behind some of the most exciting architectural designs. It's time to dive in.
Alex, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you, Yuri. How are you doing?
I'm thrilled to have you here with us today. We're just kind of chatting a little bit behind the scenes that we cannot believe they already entered the last quarter of the year. That's been insane.
Yeah. Fall is here.
Can you tell me a little bit what 2023 has been for you?
Yeah, it's been an interesting year. I mean, I think the studio, professionally, the studio has evolved quite a bit in the last 3 years. Like I think everyone has. Post-COVID, we changed the working model a little bit. We changed the focus of the work a little bit, not, somewhat intentionally and also somewhat as a kind of a responsive measure. So that feels quite different. And I think it's just evolved into a place that feels pretty good. And also just personally, it's been a year of kind of like reflection and re-examination. I have a son that's almost 2 years old. So it's been a lot of thinking about what we want, what my wife and I want in our lives, and how we want our lives with our son to be, including where we want to be, what we want our days to be like. So it's been quite a full year so far, but one that's been a little bit of like I said, reflection, but also I think in terms of Snarkitecture, sort of benefiting from the last couple of years of work that we put into the structure and the kind of approach of the studio.
Do you think the fact that, as you mentioned before, you'll be benefiting for the last few years of the success of the firm, that kind of allow you to take some space and have those more personal reflection about your personal life now that the business has been doing well, or,
a little bit, yeah. I mean, kind of both sides, because I think particularly in the heights of COVID 3 years ago, of course, we were all kind of struggling and scrambling to figure things out. But I think as things have become more kind of stabilized, and I think especially just the way that our studio culture and let's say maybe working culture at large has shifted, that has. I don't think it's that I work less. It's just that I have more flexibility, and I think I spend more time working from home or working from places that I'm able to be with my family also. So I think in those ways that, it feels different than it would have been maybe 4 or 5 years ago.
I'm always interested to kind of hear about the origin stories of a firm and the partnerships and things like that. So I guess let's start from there. I know you started the business in 2008 in the height of the big recession that we had. We did the same thing in our end when we started our business. So we almost said, I don't want to say we're bulletproof, but we went to the thick of it, right?
Yeah.
So very little things can scare us, and we know the ability to be flexible and adapt. But those early conversations, with Daniel, before you even started the business, what it was like? What you were exploring, talking about this possibility, and what about him and what about you that made this a successful, or at least an idea of a successful partnership?
Yeah, so Daniel and I have known each other since we were 18. We went to school together in New York for college, and he went to art school and I went to architecture school at a place called Cooper Union in the East Village. And we were just friends from school, and I've always been interested in art. He's always been interested in architecture, and I think that's reflected in both his art practice, but also in his collaboration with me in Snarkitecture. So when he was in school, or when we were in school, he was working on some projects that required some architectural expertise. And so he asked me to collaborate or consult with him on those. And out of those kind of that working relationship, a couple years after he graduated, we were just working on kind of one-off projects. Some of them were under his name. Some of them were more collaborative, that were more architectural opportunities, or specifically projects of his that were integrated into architectural settings. And so through that kind of discussion and series of projects, we just started talking about, and he kind of pitched it as let's start a firm, let's start an office. And at the time, I think I was like 26 and sort of had been out of school for a few years. And it seemed, it was kind of ridiculous, like actually, just because I think, especially in architecture, there is a kind of a standard or an expectation that you kind of pay your dues over decades, and sort of grow to set something up, and that it can be quite difficult to kind of start something on your own younger, partly from experience, but also just partly from a business standpoint too. So I kind of appreciated how unusual it seemed, and there was one particular sort of moment where we really started talking about what the practice could be, how we would approach it, what we wanted out of it, what to call it. It was on a project that we were working on together in LA, and we were out there for like a week or so. And so every night after we were done working, we'd go to this the bar at this kind of wild restaurant that's on it's in Hollywood, or near Hollywood in Beverly Hills, called or West Hollywood in Beverly Hills, called Dan Tana's, and it's kind of like a local. I don't know. Seems kind of legendary to me. It's like a lot of like sort of B or C list kind of celebrities, and but it's been around forever. And anyway, we just loved going to that bar and hanging out and talking about what we wanted to do. And out of it came this word like snarkitecture, which we felt like was memorable and playful and sort of spoke to something like a little bit subversive, but also we wanted and were interested in this thing that also would be productive and kind of positive in a way and playful, so that it didn't have to be cynical or kind of a negative thing. But at the same time, I think we were both very interested in pushing against what we saw as the convention or the sort of limitations of what other people were doing at that time, and what to some larger extent, just like what architecture as an industry and as a discipline, what we felt were some limitations or just things that felt sort of inaccessible to maybe people like younger people, people that maybe weren't all in or didn't have the right credentials or whatever that might be. So it really was an experiment at the beginning in terms of bringing art and architecture together in a kind of a ongoing collaborative way, not something that would be project based or one off, but something that could investigate the relationship between those disciplines and the sort of peripheries of them over a longer period of time and over a number of projects.
So when you talk about some of the cynicism that you mentioned and about things that was out of touch and the architecture, you're referring more to the butt down approach, the traditional way the architecture has been portrayed, or an architect has been portrayed for the last 3 years.
Yeah, and like I was coming out of school in like the mid-aughts, and I think there's always been the kind of architect as single author, Snarkitect kind of model. But that was really starting to gain some steam, I think, in the early 2000s. And I think that was one part of it, was that there was a kind of, that there was a sort of a unattainable sort of, not even the celebrity side of it, but just the Snarkitect side of it. And I think that, architecture is something that I think is often thought of because it is expensive and it's heavy and it's permanent. And it's all these things that you have to have a lot of resources to be able to create it. It takes a team, not only to design it, but to engineer it and to build it, and to maintain it. And we had no idea what we were doing, but we also thought we could do something different, and thought we could do something that would be, a little bit irreverent in the sort of the face of that. And the other thing that I think was sort of in the mix for me was, at the time, there was a lot of focus and interest in emerging digital technologies, and like no knock on that. Like that's an important way for, that the world evolves and that we evolve. But for me, there was so much focus on what at the time was like parametric modeling and sort of generative, computer generated forms. And I think we talked about ways that, like simpler ways that things could be made, and like more intuitive and sort of ultimately more like primitive ways that things could be shaped by hand and shaped in this kind of like what we were interested in getting at was something that wasn't so fixed and wasn't so like precise, but something that could be a bit more almost dreamlike, that would come out of this kind of, you weren't sure where it came from, and you weren't sure if it was real, if it wasn't real, if it was rational, if it was irrational, and playing with that idea a little bit and creating objects and environments that would ask people or invite people to reimagine something that they thought they knew or thought they understood, to perceive it in maybe a new way. And through that, to think about reimagining our relationship with our surroundings, our architectural surroundings specifically.
So looking back to those days in West Hollywood, meeting at the bar, having those conversations and really exploring the ideas and concepts. 2 questions. Number 1, back then, what was your drink of choice? And then still the same one?
That's a good question. I think we were just drinking, I think we were drinking like dirty martinis, because it's like a very, like, I don't know, it's like an old Italian restaurant, you know?
Yeah.
So I still like a martini, but...
The second question would be doing those long nights with martini, and how long it took by the time the first conversation started and the idea started developing up to the point that the business were open.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of these things that like a while, like we probably talked about it for, I'm going to say like maybe 6 to 12 months. Just like he was living in Miami, I was living in New York. And so we had this kind of correspondence going. And then it started to consolidate, and Daniel was moving back to New York. I was in Greenpoint, and I was just like in Brooklyn, and I was like scouting studio spaces and got a studio space. And, you know, starting, at least the way we started a business then, as you mentioned, in 2008, kind of right in the height of the global financial crash and recession, it was not, like, it was just, we were just doing it. We just were doing what we knew and what we thought you should do, which things just grow over time. So there was like no business plan. It was just us. And so what the studio was like literally just us in a room. It was like the 2 of us, 2 desks, whatever other sort of office or studio creative things we had. But that's where it started. Daniel he had a rabbit, a pet rabbit that he brought from Miami that lived at the studio. And over time, it like really just slowly grew. So, I'm going to say the first few months was literally just the 2 of us in this room. And then we started to like have a couple things to work on. We started needing a little bit of help here and there. And yeah, it took a few years. I'd say, you know, there were a couple kind of early projects. The very, very first kind of like real commission we got was a project for our artist residency program in Miami, that we were designing. Kind of a developer was converting a building into artist residency, into an artist residency. And so we sort of like redesigned that. And then we got a big project that was a public art project in Miami also, at the Marlins, as a baseball stadium there. And so that was the first project that we had that was like really, you know, at the time that was like a 2 to 3 year kind of timeline, and it allowed us to kind of start to bring people in, and also gave us enough runway that we could start to, work on some other projects in the meantime too.
So those early months when it was just you and Daniel and you at the studio really hustling, trying to get something going, what do you miss the most of those days?
I mean, yeah, I think there's for sure a kind of creative energy and excitement around like the hustle of the like we're going to make this work, and you know you're younger, you have an infinite amount of time, or at least you know that's how it felt, and so I think there's things that were really exciting and really like inspired about that period of time. But I don't know that I would go back to it, you know, like, I think I also came out of like architecture school mentality of like more time equals better results. And that's not always true. Sometimes you don't need to put in, you know, all-nighters all the time. Actually, I would say almost never do you need to do that in my sort of experience. But, yeah, I think there's something about the energy and kind of creativity when something is starting, and I think that almost anything, right? It's like the kind of it's as something launches from concept to reality. And I think I still see that on every project we work on, that there's this kind of moment where things come out of a discussion, a sketch, a drawing, and you have to figure out how to make it real. And so, we still do that sort of with every project we do. But at the time, it was like making the practice real, right? And sort of like growing it and building it. So yeah, I think having that kind of like the dialogue and the excitement really about like building it in a way that felt very like organic and holistic, and just kind of like we were doing what we wanted to do.
You touch base about the idea of all-nighters. That I think is a very interesting point, because this is something that I still hear from students. Putting all-nighters, as a mentality, that's still around. For you, as you mentioned, you don't really believe that's always the case. At what point that shift, that you start realizing that more time is now always better, that you can be able to, do the great work, the same quality of work with less time in your hand?
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, like the building and creating Snarkitecture was like part of that shift, was going from a kind of again, I was only a few years out of school, and particularly at Cooper, there was a kind of an emphasis on, productivity, like critical productivity, but at the same time, there was a bit of a culture around like, hey, you should be working a lot. That said, I had one friend at Cooper who was amazing, so gifted, and she left every day before dinner. She was like done, and her work was as good as anyone else's, if not better. And so I think that there are certain early glimpses of like there are other ways of working and other sort of modes of creation and production. But yeah, I think treating like on one hand, I think we very much embraced the idea of Snarkitecture as a kind of experimental creative practice, something that was sort of outside of the bounds of what anyone else was doing or what we saw in sort of like architecture or design or offices. And but at the same time, the kind of the structure and consistency of a practice doesn't even have to be a business necessarily, but the idea of like showing up, putting in the work, but also having some kind of like boundaries around that. It wasn't like overnight, but I think that started to kind of, it became clear that was healthier. And that I think is like a big part of it, is just like for people, for me, for you, for anyone who's like working, everyone has their own limits. Everyone has their own kind of preference or focus. But for me, I know that's not working 80 hours a week or, pushing my limits continuously in terms of like where I'm putting my time with work. So I think finding that balance, I think part of it was starting the business. Part of it is like, getting older and like having relationships and like now, as you mentioned, you have kids too. It's like, it's a game changer, and it just like requires you to be very disciplined and focused with how you spend your time.
Do you have a method or a part of your day that you feel you're more creative, or you should prioritize creativity at that specific time, or it's more organic, comes and goes as spontaneously?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's like part of the like year of reflection, is trying to sort of work on some of those things, because I think 2 years ago, before my son was born, I felt like I had kind of a maybe not infinite time, because I still sort of wanted things to be a bit more structured and have a sort of good boundaries and some balance between work and personal life. Now, so I think then things were more sort of free flowing, and I would sort of find those moments of creativity in different times of the day and in different places. One thing that was important to me for a long time was the studio. Snarkitecture studio it was in Greenpoint initially, and then it was in Long Island City in Queens. And I would always walk there. So like the first studio was a 20-minute walk. The other studio was like a 35-minute walk. And so I'd walk to and from work basically every day. And I really, I valued that a lot. It was time that was, sort of very like personal time. And also I love walking, and I love walking in any city, but especially New York. And so I think the idea of like walking the same route and the same kind of path each day allows you to discover new things about it, and discover new ideas too. And so that was something that was part of my routine that I actually like maybe miss the most about where the world's gone and where our studio's gone, is that because we're now like a little bit more hybrid, and because the studios physically moved locations to Manhattan, those are things that are no longer part of my routine. So now what I'm working on is trying to be a bit more structured in terms of like setting aside specific times to focus on wider ideas, maybe more creative or strategic thinking. But at the same time, like the ideas come when they come. They're like, and a lot of times those now come out of conversation or dialogue, particularly in the studio. So like the studio team is bringing things forward, or they're presenting designs, and I am more than anything really like functioning and operating as a kind of a creative director or critic within the studio, and sort of like guiding and helping develop and helping to kind of refine the designs. And through that, we're covering like a really wide array of conversations and areas in any project, everything from like the concept to the experience to the design to the materials. And, I think those are some of the most kind of like creatively productive parts of my day, are engaging in that kind of conversation and collaboration with everyone on the team.
Creativity is an interesting thing, and it's a question I ask often enough, but I'm curious to hear your opinion. Can you exercise? Can you develop a creativity? It's either something you're born with, or can you really craft that as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I sort of I feel like I can only respond based on like my personal experience, and sort of, I guess, what I've seen, sort of in academic and professional circles. But I mean, my sense is that that kind of like creative talent is innate. Like I think you can practice it for sure, and you can develop it and refine it. It's not quite like you either have it or don't, because obviously it's this very wide spectrum. But yeah, I think there are certain people that are innately have more of a creative outlook, right? Like, I mean, not everyone is in creative fields, and so there's a lot of people that don't view the world through that lens. They're not visual thinkers, they're not spatial thinkers, they think in other ways, whereas like I feel more attuned to those sorts of frameworks. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it's pretty hard to teach it's pretty hard to teach and develop at certain levels. That said, I think there's also like in the studio, for instance, we ask everybody to bring their own view and their own kind of approach, but at the same time, they have to kind of blend that or marry it within the framework of the studio, so that there's a kind of a coherence to the, there's not 10 separate, there are 10 separate designers, but they're all designing we're working collaboratively towards like a single goal. And so I think there are ways that, we can all, shift and modify and learn and develop ways to design together in a way that feels more cohesive or coherent towards a single goal. And I would also say, like, I'm also speaking on behalf of like my personal taste, right? So like,
yes, of course.
This is an important distinction where like someone else might say, oh, like, that person has incredible design skills, or that person has incredible taste. And taste differs, right? Like, it's just something that's subjective to each of us.
Yeah, I find sometimes the teachable thing perhaps is not the creativity, but the appreciation of it. That perhaps you can show people where to look at and try to understand what make that feel, try to understand what's going on and what is the point of that. I think that's something a lot of times when we're talking to kids, young kids, though, you kind of see that there is a room for opportunity to develop. Now, again, not everybody will be able to, there's a spectrum of creativity that varies tremendously. But I think that's the interesting thing that I always try to seek when I have the opportunity to show and try to be a vessel to show appreciation. But I'm not an architect. I'm around a lot of creative people, but I'm an enthusiast. I appreciate everybody's work, but it's not something that I will be able to do myself. I think that's where a little bit where I feel like I stand with that. But how old were you that you realized, or you started realizing that you were a creative person, that perhaps you see the world a little bit more colorful, a little bit more, geometrical than the other kids or the other, the other people around you?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, pretty young. I think it was something that was really encouraged, like my parents, but specifically like my grandmother. I remember being very like, she was like a very successful kind of inspiring person. And at a very young age, I remember her encouraging me to, well, one, pursue anything I wanted, but also like she traveled a lot. And I remember she went to Sydney and like brought me, there's a postcard and something else from like the opera house there. And it was like, oh, architecture, engineering. And so I think of her as the person who kind of started to like open a door for me to like that was something that people did, that there was this sort of world of like designing and building buildings, and like young, like I don't know, 5, 6, 7, kind of like that age. I love, like, this is a stereotypical architect thing, but I love Legos. Like I was really sort of obsessive about Legos, and yeah, I don't, I'm still coming around to the idea that, and doing better, trying to do better and understanding that other people see the world very differently from me, right? Like I just sort of, I think it's easy to think about the way that we see the world is the way that everybody sees the world, which of course is not the case. So in some ways I didn't think it was that unusual. I just thought that was, maybe what people did. But as I grew, like as I became a teenager, I started focusing a little bit more. So like I went to school, there was a few class, like there's a good art program there. So I started taking more art classes, and there was a really strong design program there. So there's a couple of teachers in my high school that were really like instrumental to helping me like develop and discover things. And yeah, sort of fairly early on, I was like, architecture seems like the thing. Even though now we do architectural work, but yeah, I feel still sort of like outside of it a little bit.
Yeah, interesting. Because you and a lot of creative people see the world differently, do you find yourself sometimes frustrating trying to explain people your vision? Perhaps a client or anybody else doesn't really see the way you see it. How do you come through with that vision from paper so someone else can understand where you want to go with this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like to think about it in a really like direct, simple way. Like I feel like that's how I can sort of appreciate different ways of sort of viewing things and talking about things and understanding things. But like when I talk about what we're designing and what we're kind of presenting, particularly to a client, but really to anyone, is like, it's often a very one-to-one level of like, this is what you see, this is what you feel. This is what the possibilities are in terms of like physically what you can do, or from a kind of a sensorial kind of perspective. So something that's tactile, something that's tangible, something that's visible, how the space, is it warm or cold? Is it quiet or loud? What kind of like feeling, like emotional response might that space evoke? And I think, I think that can be a good way for people to kind of relate to what the space is, because we can all look at like, a floor plan or a rendering and sort of make our own kind of assumptions or sort of inhabit that in a way. But I think what can make that stronger is to pair that visual representation with like some sort of like, something that you hopefully can feel in your body, or at least subconsciously have some kind of connection to.
How important is the aspect of storytelling for you when you work on those projects to make sense that there is a beginning, a middle, and an end? Mm-hmm. So when people experience, they have a wholesome experience of the environment.
Yeah. I mean, some like from a storytelling perspective, I often wish I was better, or like think I would be benefit from being better at sort of telling that story. Um, I think that what I run up against or try to avoid is making projects or describing projects in a way that feels prescriptive. Um, so, in other words, to me, I'm not trying to make projects that can only be experienced in one way or that have like a very sort of set path. Certainly, there's paths that, let's say, most people take or paths that we might sort of encourage or invite. But I do think the narrative part and the sort of the storytelling part becomes important at like an individual level for each person that's entering into a space that's architecture designs or environment that we design, where there is kind of a beginning and a middle and an end, or at least there's like a beginning and an end, and who knows what's happening in the middle. But hopefully that feels a little bit more open-ended. But for me, I think about it in a kind of, there's always a journey, whether you're like thinking about something or moving through something. And we want to invite people on a journey that feels remarkable, that feels memorable, that feels like there's something, let's say, outside of your everyday experience there. And so I think about the journey or the experience unfolding. Something that, like, an example would be walking into a space and not being able to understand the entire space, right? You're invited to or encouraged to explore, to discover something within it. So yeah, I think of it, I mean, it could be like a choose your own adventure kind of thing, right? It's not like here's the narrative or here's the story, but we're setting up a condition that allows you to explore and discover your sort of own story within that space.
A lot of times when I listen to conversation with directors, writers, people in the creative field as well, they talk often of creating something that they would like to see themselves, and that will find an audience eventually.
Yep.
When you're going through this process, a lot of times you work with the clients, of course, their input, they will have value on their input, but your approach is looking through the eyes of an audience, or more as the creative force looking for the audience to understand what you want to portray.
Yeah, I mean, I think the probably the most direct answer is, yeah, I design for myself and like what I feel is going to be a compelling space. That said, I think architects and designers, at least ones that I think are doing a good job, are also thinking about others just at large. I'm not the one who's going to be sort of using every space, so it depends on what the brief is, what the project is, what the kind of opportunities are. But generally speaking, we as a studio are interested in creating spaces that are accessible and engaging for as wide of an audience as possible. That said, it's like impossible to design literally for everybody. So that's where I use the sort of the framework of like, what would I be interested in? What would I want to see? What would I want to do? And then think about how that might apply to people that are different. And I think that's where having a studio of people with diverse backgrounds, people with diverse interests, like that can help expand that. Because there's a limitation to like the world that I know or or any one person knows. And so I think it's a balance. But I think the other thing is, like, at the end of the day, we're also designing almost every project in some ways has a kind of there's goals, right? There's the way that our studio works is that typically a client will hire us or commission us to design a project. And sometimes those briefs or those kind of commissions are very open-ended. Like, they can almost be kind of carte blanche. Like, I need something, but like whatever you want. And those, obviously we love doing that. That's like, can be very freeing and rewarding. And other times they're like, quite specific. It might be a retail space that's like, hey, here's how many SKUs we have, and this is what we need to fit into the space. But other than that, go wild, or we actually needed to do something really specific. Can you help us shape it? So there's always that kind of like designer mentality too, of like, how do we solve a problem here? And that problem might be, how do you fit all the SKUs into the space? Or that problem might be, how do we create an object or an environment that feels incredibly rewarding or memorable or remarkable?
I hear also a lot of times people saying when there is a problem or there's a limitation, you open up the door for more creativity to solve that problem, to find different ways to take an approach. Do you have a preference in terms of a project, one that you have a white canvas, you can just go ahead and go wild with it, or the one that has perimeters and limitations, so will force you to kind of push the boundaries a little bit more in the team to come up with something more interesting within that framework?
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, it's easier to have the framework or to have the limitations because there's something immediately to respond to, and to kind of, oftentimes they're trying to push against or push beyond. And so that becomes kind of like, okay, here's the box, or here's the kind of the page, and like, how do we at least ask the questions and have discussions with the client that, invite them to do something new or invite them to do something beyond their comfort zone. To be totally honest, it kind of depends on if we're talking about like Snarkitecture projects, to some extent that does depend on the client, because some clients, I think, are very open and, let's say, trusting, in the sense that like we'll show them something and they're like, great, let's make it. And then I think other clients are either have more specific tastes, or maybe are unsure about which direction to take. And then it's actually helpful to have, because if we're just designing within a sort of a white space or a white box, there's really nothing to kind of test against and no other sort of like limits to it. So to that end, sometimes it is helpful to have the parameters or the sort of constraints of whatever they might be.
I'm a little curious, kind of going back to the teenager Alex that was very interested in architecture. And if you had an opportunity to reconnect with yourself back then, what would you tell yourself? Would you think that younger version of you would be proud of what you have accomplished so far?
I think so. I mean, yeah, it's an interesting exercise. I think, when we started Snarkitecture, I personally had no expectations for it, meaning like I didn't know whether it would be a one month or 1 year kind of experiment, or whether it would be something else. And, to that end, it's always kind of surprised me in a very positive way. And yeah, I think, we all have these kind of like unexplored or like the path untaken, right? Yeah. And I think there's always those other versions of like, well, what if it had sort of gone this way, or what if I had gone that way? Yeah, to answer your question, I think, yes, there's certainly like, of course, there's things that probably could have been done better or more efficiently or a little bit less painfully. But like at the end of the day, yeah, I feel very proud about what like the work I've done, and in turn the work that the studio's done as a whole.
Who was a big influence for you when you started?
That's a good question. There was the kind of the more, I would say, like revered and serious kind of side of architecture that was the tradition I was educated in at Cooper. Mm-hmm. So there were teachers at the school who were like, legendary and sort of, in that regard, also inspirational, and just so uncompromising in their work. And I think that I had a professor named Raymond Abraham first year, and Professor Diane Lewis in fourth year, that were like both very, just brilliant, both academically but also creatively and architecturally. And I just respected that they did their own thing. There was no commercialism to their work. It was just they did what they wanted to do. And so from that end, there's the kind of like I was, really into Peter Zumpler as like a young, young architect, and Herzog de Meuron and those kinds of offices. And at the same time, I really, I felt connected to something that was like more irreverent and more playful, and that's less common in architecture, but like was something that was for sure existing in design. Particularly in that I was a teenager in the late 90s, basically, mid to late 90s. And, like Drew was operating in the Netherlands, and like that kind of to me that felt so like fresh and just their kind of humor in the way that they approached a lot of their work, or the designers in that collective approached their work. And Tobias Wong and Citizen was like coming up in New York at that time. And again, just something that was like, it was like anti-establishment in a way that was like quiet. It was very quietly subversive, like beautiful design, beautiful execution. But there was this like sort of critique built into it that I was really, really attracted to. So, and then I'm sure there's many artists that I was looking at that were like, playing, which I liked a lot.
When you look at the current state of architecture and all the new firms coming out right now, I'm sure you have opportunity to speak with students as well. You're very involved in the community in New York. Are you bullish? Are you excited about what the future of architecture looks like, including technology, how AI is involved, and even the mindset to a more playful, perhaps, architecture as well?
Yeah. I mean, I think I can't speak to that. I haven't fully investigated or wrapped around the AI implications of architecture and at large. But, I think, broadly speaking, I should find out who this quote is from, but like months ago, I read something that was basically the message was like, teenagers are always right. Like you'll never win, right? Because like they are going to be you. Like the new generation will always win. You just go away. And I think there is, there's obviously a lot of like justified and incredibly deep concern about where we are as people and as a world, right? And there's some like serious reckoning and work that needs to be done to sort of avert the path we're on. And I think there is some real both optimism, but also like activism around specifically in architecture and design, just designers choosing other paths and working towards those goals. And so that's something that like, I think about, and it's like we're working on too, but I also know that, there's younger designers that have more, they're more attuned and they're more, let's say flexible in the way that like when you're starting something, if you start it towards a sort of specific focus, I think. So I think the short answer is like, yes, I think there's a lot of excitement. And I also think that there's the world's changed a lot in 15 years, right? In terms of, I think and this is not like, this is not completely accurate, but my feeling was in 2008 when we started was like, there was not a lot of openness towards like interdisciplinary approaches and towards younger people working on the types of things that we wanted to work on. Whereas like so much of that is broken down now, right? Like that things have become increasingly blurred. There's increasing openness around that things don't have to be one thing or another. And that I think specifically for younger generations, that's like not even oftentimes it's not even questioned, right? It's just, of course, this thing can belong to this or be part of this in a way that I think for generations above us would have been thought of in a more kind of traditional or conventional sense. So, I think there's definitely reason for some optimism in terms of like where architecture and design are going. I think we hopefully continue to learn from our mistakes and learn from our successes too.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the firm has been so successful in the last 15 years and more than ever, more recently in the last 3 years, do you feel pressure or responsibility in terms of the next project needs to look like? A lot of times I think pressure is a privilege sometimes because people really have a lot of expectations. And your firm has really much set yourself apart for creating some very special environment in spaces. Is that something in the back of your mind and your team mind every time you tackle a project that one needs to live up to not only your own standards, but now the world expectations as well?
I mean, I think back to the like who what do I create the work for, and like what sort of drives me. And so I think to that, and I don't actually feel like that much external sort of pressure. It's really more like on behalf of myself and the studio. Like, yes, like you mentioned, there's just a baseline of like excellence that, we strive for and do our best to maintain on every project we do. And just like I couldn't do it if we didn't do that. Like that's just sort of who I am and what what I think is important in any work, but specifically our work. And I think, there's always a balance, right? Like this kind of you always have to weigh things and sort of make things work. And in the studio, I mean, there's other factors, but like on one hand, there's the creative side. And on the other hand, there's the business side of like, yes, it's a creative practice, but it's also a small business. And so we're sort of always weighing those. If you're just looking at the two, you're weighing those two in terms of what's best for the practice as a whole, right? Like if there's no practice, there's no work, meaning like there's no creative work. And if there's no creative work, there's no business, right? So they're sort of intertwined, completely intertwined. And we just try to find the balance that allows us to not only continue, but like continue to evolve. Like I don't mean grow in terms of scale, but grow in terms of that could be excellence or expertise or improvement, engagement. I think this is part of the sort of evolution over the last few years has been to not only grow and evolve the culture of the studio to a place that is more supportive and is better for our team, which I think is an incredibly important part of what like we all do as entrepreneurs or business owners or leaders within teams. But also that sets us up for being more responsible in a way in terms of like not only how we do our work, but what kinds of work we're doing. And these are all things that like are continuing, it's not something that happens overnight, it's something we're continuing to engage with and think about.
Do you think about legacy?
Someone asked me this recently. Weirdly, no, I don't think so. I don't know if that's weird, but no. In some ways, like I think, your question about like, would my teenage self be proud of what I've accomplished? And like, I think yes. And I think the other thing that I've been thinking about, again, this is like a lot of, I don't know how you felt when you had kids, but like, things change, right? It sort of changes your outlook and changes who you are and how you feel in a way. And, I always, like I said, wanted to balance or have those boundaries between professional life and personal life. And now more than ever, there's things that are, ultimately more important to me, right, than work or than creative work. And that's like my family, my wife and my son, and being with them and enjoying our lives together. And so, there are, I'd say, kind of a different perspective and sort of different priorities that I've found in the last couple of years.
It's kind of reassuring knowing that something that you hold precious for so long, like your work, when you're someone who's very career driven, very focused in your art and your craft, and then you have this little thing that comes in the world and just flip your world upside down and nothing else matter anymore. But for sure, it's a very, very special moment. Yeah,
and it's a very different it's a different kind of project, right? It's like, I think the cliche is that it's like the most difficult job you'll ever have, like the most difficult job you'll ever have, but also like the most rewarding. And I think that, for me, that's true. And I think for a lot of people.
Very important question. Is he sleeping through the night?
Yeah. He's actually, it's been a lot of, he's almost 2 now. So he's kind of figured that part out. But his new thing this week is he's getting up at 5:30, which is a little bit earlier than I think we'd prefer, but he's great. He's fantastic.
There's a big dynamic shift when you at least you can put it together 6 to 8 hours of sleep, straight. For sure. Those are big ones. Alex, before I let you go, there's 3 questions I ask to everybody that comes here with us and join us today. One, we would like you to recommend us a book to read. It could be one of your favorites or something that you read recently. Doesn't really matter. Something to watch, movie, TV show, documentary. And who do you think we should have here next on the podcast, I guess?
Okay. I often feel like, I don't know if this is accurate, but like identity is sort of linked to taste, and that, your what you read, what you watch is obviously like something that's a reflection of your interest, and so therefore is a reflection of who you are.
Yes.
I'll go with some just stuff that jumps into mind immediately. I read this a few years ago, but it came back up in conversation recently. The Overstory novel. Oh man, what's the author's name? So that's bad. I don't remember his name. But anyway, that was a really powerful book about, let's say just at large how our lives are sort of inseparable or inseparable from nature, and specifically like trees and forests. So that was really powerful for me. Watching, let's say, I'm like clearing some things out, and I found this box of old DVDs, which, inexplicably was holding on to. And I pulled a couple out that are like, for me, very influential. And the two that I like pulled out were Rushmore, which I watched by Wes Anderson, which I watched like nonstop when I was in high school, and Contempt by Jean-Luc Godard, which I think is just like a beautiful film, and I've always loved that film. Oh, and who should we have next? I'm gonna let you know.
Oh, to be determined.
Yeah.
TBD. Okay. Sounds good. Hey, Alex, I really appreciate it. The opportunity to, to talk to you a little bit, get to know you, a little bit of a background. You have a great demeanor about you that I was listening to a couple of interviews earlier on, that you're very calm, but you're also very focused in the moment. It looks like you're very present. So when you're talking to people, you engage with them, it's the only thing that you're thinking about. You're not like thinking about work or anything else. So I think that's one of the things that perhaps makes your work stand out. There is a level of detail and attention that you're paying to what you dealing with at the moment. And it's been a joy. I really want to thank you again so much for taking the time.
Hey, thanks so much, Yuri. I appreciate that. I feel like that's something, continue to work on, to practice, but try to do my best to be present. So thanks. And it was great to chat.
Likewise. Have a great day.
Okay. Thank you.
Experience the world of art, design, and culture through Minded Podcast. Engage with groundbreaking artists, visionary designers, and cultural influencers, and delve into their creative processes. Minded Podcast, powered by the CDA. New episodes every Tuesday.